quotas for the number of refugees that were going to be allowed, and interestingly, at the same time, they reduced the quotas on legal immigration. So what it said is like, we're going to allow a group of people who are refugees, and we'll talk about what that word means in just a second, and we're going to reduce the overall number of people coming to the United States to sort of compensate for that. Moving ahead quite a ways, now into some of your lifetime. So 9/11 happens, and right after 9/11, there was a bunch of concern from people who thought that the reason that 9/11 was able to happen was not insufficient vetting of immigrants, that there was insufficient research on backgrounds to ensure the security of the United States. And so there are two pieces of legislation. One's called the Patriot Act, and the other's called the Real ID Act. Real ID. And both of those increased restrictions and monitoring and enforcement of immigration. So it increased the amount of vetting that happened on people before they can come to the United States, and it increased the detail of the identification you had to provide, as well as a bunch of other things. So that was our extremely brief tour through history. The next thing I want to talk about is what some of these words mean. So there's a lot of words that you're going to see in immigration literature that you might not super know what they mean, or you might have like some idea what the word means, but you're not totally precise on it. So we're going to talk about some definitions for a minute here, so that when you see these words later on today, when you're looking at evidence or you're talking in lab, we can sort of all have a same general frame for what we're talking about. So the first word is alien, and that does not mean person from outer space, at least not in the immigration legal context. What legally alien means is a person who is not a U.S. citizen and not a U.S. national. So not a U.S. citizen and not a U.S. national. A citizen is a person who is any one of the following. So to be a citizen, you have to be one, or sometimes more, you might be more, but at least one of the following. Number one, someone who is born in the United States. So if you are born in the United States, you are a United States citizen. The second is if you have a parent who is a citizen. The third is if you are a former alien who has been naturalized as a citizen. So let's break that down for a second. That means you are someone who was not born a citizen, but you went through the United States citizenship process of many years and took all of the tests and then became a citizen. And then the fourth is that you were born in Puerto Rico, Guam, or the U.S. Virgin Islands. So U.S. territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands, if you were born there, you are a citizen. So citizen, born in the U.S., parent who is a citizen, someone who used to not be a citizen, you used to be an alien, and then you naturalized as a citizen, or you were born in Puerto Rico, Guam, or the Virgin Islands. That last one, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands, is something that came up a bunch last year after the hurricanes, when there was a lot of people who didn't super understand that people who are born in Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens. So there were a lot of people who were talking about, like, politically saying things like, you know, we should only be helping the hurricane victims who are U.S. citizens, just like super not realizing that Puerto Rican people are absolutely U.S. citizens. So that's something to sort of keep in mind. If you noticed in those two definitions that an alien is a person who is not a U.S. citizen or a U.S. national, and then you said, okay, Maggie, you define citizen, what is this U.S. national thing? I included this at the bottom. There are not very many people who are considered U.S. nationals. It's a really small category. And what it is people who were born, born in American Samoa or the Northern Mariana Islands. And that's a U.S. national. There's not going to be a lot topic related there, but I didn't want to say that this thing is something or something and then not tell you the second something. All right, the third word I want to talk about is immigrant, an immigrant. An immigrant is legally defined, is someone who has been given permission, an alien, so someone who is not a citizen, who has been given permission to live permanently and work without restrictions in the United States. So an immigrant is someone who gets to live here permanently and work without restrictions within the United States. There are two related terms that you might have heard. One is the very next term, the lawful permanent status. So another term for immigrant is someone who has LPR, They are a lawful permanent resident. And then the colloquial term you might have heard for this is someone who has a green card. So if you've heard about green card, somebody having a green card, what that means is that they have permission to live here permanently and work without restriction in the United States. They might be a citizen, they might not be a citizen, but they get to stay permanently. So LPR, which is something you're going to be seeing a lot, is the same legal definition as immigrant. It is a non-citizen who can stay and work permanently in the United States. As of 2014, there are 13 million people living in the United States that have LPR status. So they are not citizens, but they have permission to stay here as long as they want, and they can work here in the United States. Of those 14 million, about 9 million people are eligible to naturalize. And what that word means is, it's another one of these legal terms, that means undergo the process to become a citizen. So most, but not all, are eligible to naturalize. In general, someone who has an LPR status is eligible to undergo the process for citizenship, to naturalize, after between 3 and 5 years, depending on your status. And to do that, you need to prove that you have no arrests, that you've paid your taxes, you have to undergo the citizenship classes, take the citizenship test, and sort of undergo that process to move from someone who has permission to live here and work here permanently but is not a citizen to move to someone who is a citizen. And there can be delays in that process as well. Another word that's useful to know is non-immigrant. Non-immigrant. In the context of the topic, non-immigrant means an alien, so someone who is not a U.S. citizen or a U.S. national, with temporary status in the United States. So LPR, or immigrant, means you can stay here and work here permanently. Non-immigrant says that you have permission to be here, but you only have permission to be here temporarily. And some of those people have permission to work here and some of them do not. We're talking about things like students, exchange students, or college students who are living in the U.S. to go to college. We're talking about things like business visitors. If you're coming here for a conference, you would be a non-immigrant. We're talking about people who have what's called temporary protected status, which means that they can live here for a while, but it's temporary. And so there's a huge list of people in the non-immigrant category. Naturalized citizen. Naturalized citizen, that's a word that I sort of teased for you all here. What a naturalized citizen is someone who had lawful permanent residence status, and then they got citizenship. And that's a legal term that is contrasted with natural-born citizen. And remember, when we were looking at what a citizen is, some people are citizens by virtue of the fact that they got lucky enough to be born in the United States, or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, but they have their citizenship just by where they were born. Other people have United States citizenship because they underwent a citizenship process. And a naturalized citizen is that second group of people. You didn't used to be a citizen, you were not born a United States citizen, but you underwent the legal immigration and citizenship process, and now you are a United States citizen. That's called a naturalized citizen. All right, let's talk about two words that have been coming up in the literature a ton lately. You've probably heard some of these on the news with the family separations and all sorts of other issues. And they're refugees and asylees, or asylum seekers. Okay, refugees and asylees, or asylum seekers. So a refugee, remember we talked about the Refugee Act early in the 80s. A refugee is someone who is not in their home country. They're outside of their home country. And they are also outside of the United States. So they're in like a third-party country. Not their home country, not the United States. And they're someone who can't return to their home country because of a credible fear of persecution based on their race, their religion, their nationality, their social group membership, or their political opinion. I'll say that again. So this is a legal definition. This is internationally defined by the UN. This is someone who is not in their home country anymore, and they are also not in the United States. But they can't return to their home country because they have a credible fear that they are going to be persecuted, right? They will suffer harm due to their race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or their political opinion. And lots of times, refugees arise as a result of wars and genocides, right? That your country is no longer safe for you to live in as a result of things like war, as a result of genocides, as a result of other forms of abuse, often by the government, right? It's not safe for you to go back to the home country. The UN defines refugee, and they do a lot of the management of where refugees go. But the United States sets a cap on how many people are going to come to the United States as refugees. So there's an annual cap, and that's set by the president. And we'll talk about how that works in just a minute. The second term, asylee or asylum seeker, is the same definition as a refugee, except that that person is not in a third-party country. They are inside the United States, or they are at a United States port of entry, like a border or an airport or a port. So if you've been reading a little bit about the family separation policy that's been heavily in the news, a lot of those people are coming to the United States to seek asylum. They are on the United States border, and they are saying, I am an asylum seeker. I have a credible fear of returning to my home country based on persecution for race or religion or the other list of things, and I am seeking asylum in the United States. So refugee is in a third-party country, seeking to be resettled in a different country. Asylee is someone who's already in the U.S., so maybe you were visiting the U.S. and then something happened in your home country and you seek asylum, or maybe you have made it to a border or port of entry, and they are continuing to try and seek seek resettlement in the United States. So refugees, there's an annual cap, and that number is set by the president. Asylees or asylum seekers, there is not an annual cap. And instead, their situation is evaluated on a case-by-case basis by the immigration courts. And so that's the thing that's not working very well right now. That when people are coming to the United States, they're saying, there's credible fear here, I'm seeking asylum in the United States. They are supposed to get a case-by-case hearing. They're supposed to get their case heard by an immigration court. And those immigration courts are severely backlogged right now. And so the system is not working. Next thing to talk about is the word visa. Visa is an endorsement on a passport that indicates that you're allowed to enter a country and stay there for a particular period of time. So you get a visa, which is literally like a stamp on your passport, that says you can come to a particular country and you can stay for a certain period of time. And different visas have different amounts of times and different restrictions, but that's the idea there. The last term to talk about is undocumented alien. Undocumented alien. This is someone who either entered the United States without permission, or they entered the United States with permission, but did not leave at the end of their visa. So they entered the United States on, say, like a 3-month visa, and then they overstayed their visa. Sometimes you will hear this referred to as illegal aliens or illegal immigrants. Those are controversial terms, as is undocumented alien. But the way the federal government will refer to it, and this is what you'll see in laws, is references to undocumented aliens. All right, so let's talk about how immigration works in the United States. So we know our words, we sort of know the framework for the words that we're going to be talking about this year. We have a little bit of historical context. Let's talk about how do these policies actually go down? How does it work? So let's talk state versus federal. Remember, for the first 150 years of the United States, each state had its own immigration laws, right? And each state was mostly trying to prevent certain groups from coming to their state, and they were able to pass their own laws to do that. But in the modern era, when we're talking about restrictions on immigration, we're generally talking about federal restrictions because of those court cases we talked about. The Supreme Court has pretty consistently ruled that states can't regulate immigration where the federal government does not. So states can't have more restrictions than the federal government does. And the thing that's happening right now is that many states are having fewer restrictions, or cities are having fewer restrictions on immigrants than the federal government does. Does anybody know what the term is for a city or a state that decides not to regulate immigration as strongly as the United States? So they have fewer restrictions on legal immigration. Let's see, yeah. A sanctuary city, absolutely. Sanctuary cities and maybe eventually some sanctuary states is when the state or the city says we're going to have fewer restrictions. We are not going to enforce all these federal restrictions. And that is something that the Supreme Court is probably going to have to take up eventually because the federal government would really like these states and cities to enforce these laws more clearly. But the important thing to know is that maybe states can have fewer restrictions, they can be less restrictive, but they can't be more restrictive. And that was determined in 2010 in a Supreme Court case called Arizona v. the United States. It's a case where Arizona had the same restrictions on immigrants as the federal government did, but much higher penalties. Okay, so they had sort of a similar law as the federal law, but they enforced it much, much, much more strictly in terms of what like the penalties were for breaking that law. And what the Supreme Court determined in 2010 in Arizona v. the U.S. Is that states cannot have stricter enforcement even if it is a similar federal law. So the states cannot have more restrictions on immigration than the federal government does. So what does the Constitution say? We got Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4. You probably don't need to write that down in particular, but know that the Constitution does talk about immigration. And what it says is that the federal legislative branch, meaning Congress, right, the House and the Senate, has the power to, quote, establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So when the Supreme Court was making those decisions and said, federal government, you're in charge, and in particular, it's you, Congress, that's what they're looking at. And the Constitution says that the legislative branch is in charge of that. So the role of the Congress is primary, right? Congress has the primary role for responsibility for immigration. And then the presidents and the agencies are supposed to enforce those rules. And so when we're talking about the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, the INA, that is Congress taking their primary role over immigration. The president also has somewhat of a role in enforcing those laws. During the Obama administration, Congress argued at times that the Obama administration had not faithfully enforced the Immigration and Nationality Act, and in particular, that a couple of Obama's executive orders that Will's going to talk about in detail in a little bit, those executive orders did not mean that the president was enforcing all of the immigration powers that the Congress had delegated, that the president was not enforcing the immigration laws, and some members of the GOP consider that unconstitutional. The opposite is occurring right now, right? Trump is out ahead of Congress on restricting immigration and has gone much further than Congress has gone in sort of establishing that there are going to be lots of restrictions on immigration, both legal immigration and non-legal immigration, other forms of immigration. And theoretically, Congress could say, like, whoa, 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 like that is not what we intended with our law, like we didn't intend to have all these restrictions, but so far they have declined to do so. And we'll get into sort of the politics of why this is happening, but so far Congress has declined to say, President Trump, you're going too far on this issue. The president is also, as I mentioned before, in charge of setting the cap on the annual number of refugees, and we will look at what has happened with that cap in just a second. So next up are federal agencies. So in addition to Congress that creates the major laws and the president that's in charge of enforcing those laws, the president delegates a bunch of that authority to executive agencies who figure out how to enforce those laws. And there are several agencies that are really important in terms of figuring out how immigration law is enforced in the United States. The primary agency involved here is the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and it has 3 sub-agencies that do a lot with immigration policy. So, Department of Homeland Security, and then the other ones listed here are the 3 sub-agencies of the Department of Homeland Security. The first is the USCIS, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. And they are the one who is doing most of the enforcement. So that is what you're going to notice. They are sort of determining a lot of the policies at the nitty-gritty level. So Congress says, like, here's our overarching philosophy of immigration, and then the USCIS is the sub-agency designed for implementing that. The second is Customs and Border Protection. Customs and Border Protection. They are the ones who are literally in charge with enforcing the border, right? Making sure that ensuring the security of the border is their sort of mission. And then the third one is Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. And there's a hashtag. What is the hashtag that's been going around related to this? Abolish ICE. Yes. So ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, they are the people who within the United States are searching out for people who are here in an illegal fashion, and they are managing those deportations of people who are already in the United States. And some people say that they are going far too far in that role. And so the abolish ICE, as you all correctly noted, is the thing that's occurring right now. Other departments that have some responsibility over immigrants or immigration, the State Department, Department of State, DOS, is in charge of issuing the visas. So they are the ones who evaluate foreign nationals and actually issue those visas to say how long someone can stay in the United States. That's through that you would apply at an embassy. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, they are the ones who operate the immigration courts, and we have an immigration court system. And that is through the Executive Office of Immigration Review, the EOIR, is the immigration court system. And then finally, the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, includes a sub-agency called the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And they are in charge of taking care of refugees once they are in the United States. So the process of, if you are a refugee, then becoming someone who lives in the United States is called resettling. You are settling in a new country, resettling. The Office of Refugee Resettlement is responsible for that process. Okay, so we talked earlier about how there are immigrants and non-immigrants. And there are immigrant visas and non-immigrant visas. And an immigrant visa is a visa for someone who is coming, remember, to live in the United States and work without restriction. And there are annual numerical limits set by Congress on how many people can come to the United States. And there are also country caps. And what that means is that in general, no more than 7% of immigrants in a single year can be from a particular country. So in general, no more than 7% of immigrants in a particular year can be from a particular country. What countries do we think might be always bumping up against that cap? Yeah, what's one? There are some places in the Middle East, I think. There are some that are even more. Yeah?
India and China.
India, yep, for sure. China, sometimes, not every year, but often, yep. Not a huge problem there. Mexico, yeah. So most recently, the countries that are always bumping up against the cap are India, Mexico, and one that we didn't mention is the Philippines, for business reasons, has been having a lot of people here. There are 3 major categories of immigrant visas, and we're going to break these down in the next section. But there are 3 major categories of immigrant visas. Category 1, family sponsored. Family sponsored. Category 2, employment-based. And then category 3 is something called the Diversity Immigrant Visa, the DIV, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But there are basically 3 major categories of immigrant visas based on your family, based on your employment, and based on a diversity immigrant visa. So, looking at family-sponsored immigration. 2/3 of total legal immigrants to the United States come in via family immigration. So when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about legal immigration, who's coming to the United States. 2/3 of the people are coming here from a family connection, meaning you have a family member who has LPR or citizenship, and you are using that family connection to come into the United States. Immediate relatives are not subject to that 7% cap. But everyone else is subject to that 7% cap. So if you have a family member and you are coming from a country that has a lot of immigrants coming to the United States, it's going to take you a lot longer. Immediate relatives are not subject to that overall cap or the 7% per country cap. And when we're talking immediate relatives, we're talking about your spouse, your children under 21, your parents, and then if you were married to a citizen who has since died, a widow or widower of a citizen. Non-immediate relatives are those further out family connections. And they are known as preference immigrants because it goes in order of how close the connection is. Siblings in particular take forever. But other groups, they go in order of how close your connection is to someone who lives in the United States to figure out when you're going to get to come in. That is capped at about 226,000 people per year, non-immediate relatives. And again, only 7% can be from a particular country. All right, employment-based immigration. So 2/3 of people come here from a family connection. They have a family member in the United States. Of almost another third, the vast majority of the remaining third come here for employment-based immigration. It's about 140,000 people per year, and it is subject to that 7% cap. And the way it works is that there are these things that the government calls ranked preference categories. Ranked preference categories. And that goes down a list of how highly desired that immigrant is by the United States to determine how quickly and whether that they will be able to get into the United States. So I'm going to sort of describe what all these categories are. I think more important than writing down what each category is to just sort of get a sense of which people have an easier time getting in and which people have a harder time getting in. Okay, so that first category is persons of extraordinary ability in sciences, arts, education, business, or athletics. And what that means is like you're thinking like geniuses, Olympians, professionals, athletes, like the very, very, very most skilled people in a particular area. Okay? Very, very most skilled. Extraordinary ability. The next category is exceptional ability. Apparently, oops, sorry. What happened there? Oh. Okay. Exceptional ability. Apparently, exceptional ability is less than extraordinary for the government. You might just be exceptional. And those are people who have advanced degrees or a very high level of skill, but not genius level skill in those same categories. The arts, the sciences, and athletics. The next category is professionals and other workers. So those are skilled workers. They generally have an advanced degree still, but they're not extraordinarily skilled, and they're not exceptionally skilled. So it's moving down the skill ratio, if you will. Then the next category is what they call certain special immigrants. And this is a category of people that includes like religious workers, some foreign service workers, retired employees of international organizations, and some other small categories of people. And then the last one is employment creation or investors. Employment creation or investors. And what this really means is really rich people. It is people who are planning to invest at least $500,000, but usually more like $1 million in creating an American business that employs at least 10 U.S. citizens. So it is people who are coming to the United States to start a quite large business, not mom and pop business, if you will. You'll notice what is not on this group is people with, sort of average abilities, unskilled workers. If you are an unskilled worker, meaning you don't have an advanced degree in your field, you are not coming in generally through employment-based immigration. If you are someone who is unemployed, not eligible for employment-based immigration, you have to generally be sponsored by a business. So you already have to have a job that wants to hire you to bring you into the United States. So this is a category that brings in a lot of people, but it's a very particular set of people. The government is saying, like, we want this kind of worker as opposed to other kinds of workers. There are some small other categories. Mostly, these are literally called other categories. And mostly that is Iraqi and Afghan interpreters. So during the War on Terror and the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, there are a bunch of people who have worked for the U.S. government or worked for the U.S. military interpreting for our people people who are there, the invading forces, and they are interpreters. And the government said, it's maybe not that great for those people to have to keep living in the country. We need to create some incentives for people to be our interpreters. And so they created a special immigration category for those people. It is an open debate whether that has worked. There are a lot of people who say that that has not worked very well, but that is what that special category is. All right, the last thing is called this thing called the Diversity Immigrant Visa. The Diversity Immigrant Visa. And that is legal immigration from countries that don't send very many people to the United States. So it is a separate category for countries that don't send very many people to the United States. And it is, all right, so there's going to be a bunch of fives here. It is 50,000 people, annual visas, given to people whose country has sent less than 50,000 people over the last 5 years. So if you are from a country that has sent fewer than 50,000 people to the United States in the last 5 years, you are eligible, you are eligible to apply for a diversity immigrant visa. And that is selected via lottery. So after the employment and family-based, there is a separate lottery from countries that don't send very many people to the United States for the diversity immigrant visa. Originally, when this came about, it was mostly European countries, like small Western European countries. Now, it is mostly Eastern European countries and African countries that people apply for the diversity immigrant visa from. This has been really controversial recently. Does anybody know why this has been controversial recently? Yeah, way in the back.
In New York, some of the victims tied to ISIS, and they had something on
Okay, and what is the sort of result of the sort of anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States? What might happen to the diversity immigrant visa, or what is the government position on that? I'm sorry, can you talk a little bit louder?
Those who have very anti-immigrant sentiments are very hostile.
Yeah, so what has happened is that Trump has made some claims that people who come here on the diversity immigrant visa don't have skills and they are not vetted. And that is not correct. He would like to eliminate the diversity immigrant visa altogether. That is not correct. They still have to, if you are selected for the diversity immigrant visa, you still have to be a skilled worker, and you still have to be vetted through all of the same processes any immigrant is vetted. So there's no real reason to believe that people who are coming via the diversity immigrant visa are any more likely than anyone else to be a problem. But because they are coming from countries that don't send very many people to the United States, there is a sentiment among anti-immigration forces that this is like an extra bonus thing that maybe people shouldn't get. So Trump wants to eliminate this altogether, even though the claim that they are not vetted and unskilled is not correct. I saw a question, yeah?
Do they all three types of visas take around the same amount of time to get granted?
They do not. Basically, getting a visa into the United States, the shortest it can take is a couple of years for someone who is eligible. The longest it can take is like 30 years. There are some places where the list basically just stretches to infinity. And so really, even though you are technically eligible, you are never really going to get that visa. And so the waiting list depends very much on the type of visa that you're looking at. In particular, moving down the preference categories and then moving toward non-immediate relatives, those lines take way longer. And so that is why some people apply for the diversity immigrant visa, but it is not a fast process. Like, one thing you should understand about the immigration process is for people who are saying, like, immigrants should get in line. That's something you'll see a lot from anti-immigration forces, is like, get in line, come here legally. We're not talking about a short period of time, right? The line is not like you wait 6 months and then you have this visa. For some people who are eligible to come to the United States, that line could be, half of your life that you would be waiting to get that visa. And so that's important context. That's a great question. All right. There's also categories of non-immigrant visas. Non-immigrant visas. And there is an interesting debate about whether non-immigrant visas are part of the immigration topic. And it sort of depends on how you define the term legal immigration, and you'll be talking about that in your lab, but I sort of want to tease that, get that thinking about this in your head. Non-immigrant visas, we also have visas for non-immigrants, and those are people who are coming to live or work in the United States, but not permanently. So it's on a temporary basis. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about workers. The one that's most relevant for debate is this thing called the H-1B visa, H-1B. And that allows U.S. companies to hire workers on a temporary basis for specialty occupation. So you'll be talking about that a little bit more in lab as you sort of research the topic. But that is a category of temporary workers for specialty occupation that can eventually maybe apply for LPR status. When we're talking about non-immigrant visas, we're also talking about visitors and tourists. So if you are someone who lives in another country, let's say you live in China, and you want to come on vacation to the United States, you are a non-immigrant, right? You are coming to not live, you're coming to, with permission to work here, or sorry, to visit here on a temporary basis. If you are an exchange student or a foreign college student, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about non-immigrant visas. So if you or some of your friends might be here for a couple of years to go to college, to go to high school on an exchange program, those are non-immigrant visas. There is a list that I included in the outline, the lecture outline. There's a link to all of the non-immigrant visa categories. I would suggest sometime when you're bored, peruse that list. I don't know, maybe it'll make you more bored, but it's a really long list of non-immigrant visas, okay? It's like pages and pages and pages and pages and pages. And I thought about, sort of as a joke, putting them all up on the PowerPoint screen, and then the font was going to be like 6 font. It's enormous. It's a huge list of all the different ways non-immigrants can investigate coming to the United States. All right, refugees and asylum seekers. Who can remind me what is the difference between a refugee and an asylee? Who's like, I think I got this, refugee versus asylee? Yeah.
So refugees are in a third-party country.
Okay.
And asylees are either in the U.S. or they're at like a foreign border.
Awesome. So refugees are in a third-party country. They're not in their home country and they're not in the U.S. Asylees or asylum seekers are not in their home country. They are at the United States border or in the United States or in an airport or a port. What is a refugee? Like what were those categories again? Can somebody remind me what those were from half an hour ago or so? How can someone be a refugee? Yeah.
A fear of persecution based on race, religion, political association, and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is someone who has a fear of persecution and they are going and they are either inside the United States as an asylum seeker or outside the United States as a refugee. They are eligible to apply for a green card 1 year, so eligible to apply for LPR 1 year after entering the United States as a refugee, but they can actually start working immediately. Part of the UN Convention on Refugees and the agreement is that someone who comes here as a refugee or an asylee can work immediately. And then after 1 year in the United States, they can apply for LPR. And then they can apply for citizenship 5 years after they arrive in the United States. So 1 year later, they can apply for LPR. 4 to 5 years later, they can apply for citizenship. Remember, who sets the cap on the number of refugees? Who sets the cap? Yeah. The president. The president sets the cap on the target number of refugees. Knowing what you know about the world, do you think in the last couple of years that cap has gone up or down? Yes, you are correct. You are on the money this morning. Trump cut the quota by more than half. And then the initial versions of his travel ban further reduced access. When we're talking about families who are being separated at the border, most of those people are asylum seekers. They are trying to come to the U.S. They have credible fear. And the Border Patrol basically says, sorry, we're at capacity. We can't process you right away. 2018 was the lowest number of refugees in more than 40 years. And one thing to understand is that while there is a total cap on the number of refugees, at least in 2018, we are not going to hit that cap. So the annual year ends in September, and we're not even going to get close to the cap. And the reason for that is that Trump policies have been even more restrictive than the cap he set. So he set a cap and was like, this is the total number of people who can come. But in reality, they've made it so difficult to come to the United States as a refugee that we're not even going to hit the cap. And As of now, we are on target to be about a 70% drop in the number of refugees since 2016. So 2016 was a really high number. Obama had actually pretty highly increased the number of refugees due to problems in places like Syria and Myanmar. And Trump has cut that, and the actual number is going to be below that. Do you have a question?
Are there any years where we, like, through studies gone over the cap?
So that's a really good question. There is debate about whether, so it's called the annual number of refugees, the annual quota of refugees. There is debate about whether that number is a hard cap or like a goal. During the Obama administration, they treated it as like a goal. They set a high number, and we're like, we would like to try to reach this number. It will be challenging to reach this number because it is like hard to process all the refugees. There's a big bureaucratic process to being a refugee, but it was more of a goal. Under the Trump administration, it has become very clear that that is a cap, meaning a hard number that we will not cross, even if more people are eligible and even if there are certainly more people in need, right? There are millions of people in the globe that qualify as refugees that are never going to get to be refugees. It's about 1% of people who are eligible to become a refugee that eventually get resettled somewhere else, the United States or anywhere else. Good question. All right, immigration policy under Trump. This is the last category, and then we'll give you a little break before Will talks about our initial evidence set. I wanted to give you an update on sort of things that are happening that you might have heard about in the 2016 election cycle, but you're not totally sure what the status of those things are. So let's talk overall numbers. Trump would like to cut legal immigration in addition to deporting undocumented immigrants. So initially, when the GOP was talking about their immigration policy, they really focused on undocumented immigrants, meaning people who were here, had overstayed their visas, or had come to the United States without permission. But it has become clear over the first year and a half of the Trump administration that they are now seeking policies to also reduce legal immigration. And that, Will is going to talk about this, but that's a pretty big change from historical policies, even in the GOP, in terms of what we are looking for. In terms of preference, Trump's immigration proposal is to shift away from family reunification. Okay, so shift away from family-based immigration to almost entirely employment-based immigration and eliminate the diversity immigrant visa. So the idea there is to reduce the number of people who come to the United States because of a family connection or because of the diversity immigrant visa, and instead make it only based on a points system that he hasn't like super described, but a points system that would rate people based on their skills and only let people in that way. Does anybody know what the term is if you are someone who is anti-family immigration, so you are opposed to letting people who are immigrants to the United States sponsor their family members, what you call that process. So there's a term for the process of bringing families over that if you are an anti-immigration person, you would use that term rather than family reunification. What's it called?
Chain migration.
Chain migration, exactly. So chain migration, and there are other terms for this that are preferred. Maybe subsequent family-based migration is a term that you'll see some of our evidence use. Or family reunification is another term that the government sometimes uses. But if you are opposed to immigration, you would probably use the word chain migration. And what that means is that someone who comes to the United States can then sponsor other family members who can then potentially come to the United States who can then sponsor other family members. One thing to know about this process, as I noted before, is that it's really slow, okay? So it's not like one person comes to the United States and then immediately, 10 of their relatives come. First, 10 people are generally not eligible. And second, the whole process takes years and years and years and years and years. So when we're talking about that chain, so to speak, and that's a term that many people reject as being, sort of offensive, that's what they're talking about. Yeah.
Is there a cap on how many people, like, one immigrant can, like, sponsor over?
There is not a cap, but effectively there is a cap, just because you can bring your kids, and so that means that there are some numbers. But sibling immigration is so slow that it's very hard to bring more than a couple of people over. I think some of our evidence says that the average immigrant over the course of their life sponsors like up to about 5 people. Yeah.
Why is sibling immigration in particular so small?
Yeah, it's because they are lower in the family preference categories. So the government has an order of how closely related you are to someone to determine whether they can sponsor you for immigration. And they take people in preference order. So your parents are a higher preference than your siblings. And because of how long the delays are and these country caps, the sibling lists are many, many, many years, in many cases decades long. Yeah?
So could I bring my parent and then my parent can sponsor the sibling?
Potentially. And for someone who's opposed to immigration, that's what they're talking about with chain migration, is like you maybe can't sponsor your sibling, but you can bring your parent and your parent can sponsor the sibling. In some cases, that depends on whether your sibling is married or not. That's a fun one. The government cares about whether you are married or not in determining your eligibility to have a parent sponsor you. And it also cares about how old the sibling is. So if your sibling is young, the parent is much more likely to be able to bring them over than if they're over 21. Over 21 and married is a similarly absurdly long list. Yeah?
Can you get a visa if it's like someone that's in your family by law, but not your spouse?
Tell me what you mean by like a step sibling or something?
Yeah.
I think generally no, but I'm not totally sure on the details of that. But if you are like, sometimes that person would be eligible like through your spouse, for example, like they could sponsor their sibling or parent, but you can't sponsor your mother-in-law or father-in-law, and that's an incentive to get citizenship. Yeah.
Are grandkids part of like immediate or part of?
They are not. You are not eligible to sponsor your grandkids, but you could theoretically sponsor your kids and then they could sponsor their kids. So, if Trump's desired legal immigration strategy were enacted, so if what he has sort of described as his desired shift toward only preference categories were enacted, it would cut the number of legal immigrants by about 44% annually. It would be an enormous cut to the number of legal immigrants. And in particular, according to the Cato Institute, 57% of people who arrived here legally since 1965 would not have been admitted. So most people who have immigrated to the United States since 1965 would not have been admitted under this new policy. All right, next thing to talk about is the wall. In 2016, you heard a lot about this. You've heard a lot about it since Trump wants one. Notably, there is not. We did not build a wall, in case you're just not sure that you were missing one. And there has been an open question now about whether when he says wall, does he mean like something that we would call a wall, like the wall, or does he mean more electronic monitoring? Maybe it's more border patrol. Unclear. There is a GOP bill that was going to be maybe debated and then sort of got tabled to fund increased border protection or increased border security in exchange for some DACA-related issues that Will's going to talk about in just a second. But there is not a wall. Deportations are up. So one thing to know is that during the Obama administration, deportations were at the highest level ever. During the Trump administration, they've gone up even more. And in particular, the change is that now we are deporting people who have sort of established ties to the U.S. They have jobs, they have families, they have no criminal history, and those people are now being deported even if, for example, their minor children stay in the United States. Last one to talk about is the travel ban. Who can sort of tell me what happened about a week and a half ago at the Supreme Court? Yeah, right in there.
For the past version of Trump's travel ban, however, it's been like watered down and included countries other like outside the Middle East. And when it was originally presented to the Supreme Court, Trump called it like a disgrace. But then when it was passed, he said it was victory.
Okay, so yes. So in January 2017, Trump issued an executive order that limited travel and immigration from 7 majority Muslim countries. Chad was later removed from that list. And he referred to it as a travel ban. Subsequently, his lawyers referred to it as a travel pause, a travel delay, a travel evaluation. And they said it was not a Muslim ban, right? So during the election cycle, Trump referred to the need for a Muslim ban. Subsequently, the lawyer said, no, this is not a Muslim ban. It's just like a total coincidence that this is from 7 majority Muslim countries. Can't possibly figure out why that would be. Who knows? And about a week and a half ago, the Supreme Court said, yep, that checks out. No reason to believe that this is religiously biased at all. The president has the authority to set those immigration levels. The president's authority over immigration is essentially uncheckable or nearly uncheckable, and there's not really any reason to believe that this is a Muslim ban. That was a 5-4 decision. The 4 issued a very strongly worded dissent that included quotations from the president saying this is a Muslim ban. That as now the law of the land. It doesn't apply to refugees. That was something that the Trump administration was sued early on about the status of the refugee situation, and then it said like this violates the UN conventions that we have signed onto to exclude refugees from particular countries. And the Trump administration backed down on that. They did not defend that part of the travel ban. But overall, it means that the things that you've been hearing about the travel ban, it has been upheld. It has been in effect since September of last year because of the policy was allowed to go forward. There was an injunction that was then lifted. So really, the travel ban did not go into effect like 2 weeks ago. It went into effect last year. But it's important to note that the Supreme Court signed off on that. And basically affirmed that in terms of national security, the president has basically unlimited authority to make policies to protect national security in the area of immigration, and that Congress can do to immigration policy. All right, I will take a couple of questions, and then we will give you a little bit of a break. So where are we at on questions? Yep.
How do you define legal in the resolution?
How do you define legal in the resolution? So that's a good question. And that's a little bit more debate than we're going to go into this morning. But basically, there's sort of a question about whether legal immigration means legal immigrant, right? Someone who is coming here to stay permanently, the legal immigrant categories, or whether legal immigration is the entire process of coming to the United States legally. And so there is a debate, and you will see good evidence on both sides. Some of that evidence will say only people coming here permanently is the process of legal immigration, just getting LPR status. Other people will say that even temporary workers, as long as they are here with permission, that includes legal immigration, and that's something we're going to get to debate about. Yep. Yep, you.
At what point does, so in the resolution it says substantially?
Yep.
So at what point does some not be substantial?
Yeah, that's a great question. Debate topics started including substantially, I think, in about the 80s, and we've been debating about it ever since. Some people say substantially just means like a bunch, a large effect. We should do something to reduce restrictions in a large manner, a significant manner, an important manner. Other people sort of numerically define substantially. Maybe it means 5%, maybe it means 50%. One challenge with defining substantially numerically this year is that counting restrictions is kind of a strange thing. Like, how do you count how many restrictions there are? What does it mean to substantially reduce restrictions? I guess I would say that in the context of the resolution, substantially probably means a lot, but how that plays out in debates, it's more challenging. Yes?
So you mentioned that the president and the executive branch has the ability to interpret certain congressional statutes for immigration.
In terms of enforcing them, yep.
So how would the Chevron, which is National Resource Protection Council, does that provide the official interpretation of that?
Okay, so that is a good question and a super technical question, especially given that there's some evidence that the Supreme Court might be about to start reinterpreting Chevron doctrine. And later on today, we're going to find out a lot more about what is likely to happen in that regard, because what's happening later today? What's the president announcing later today? A Supreme Court nominee. Okay, his pick for the Supreme Court, because who just retired? Kennedy. Okay. So I guess I would say we should probably table that question to sort of figure out what's going on with the Supreme Court. But yes, the question of agency power is definitely relevant here. So far, the Supreme Court has been pretty lax in letting the president and thus the agencies set enforce those laws, and Congress has not really pushed back on that, so there's been no one really on the other side saying like, maybe this is an issue, but that is definitely something that will be related to the topic. All right, 1, 2, 3, go.
Does reducing restriction on legal immigration require like making it easier to go through a port of entry, or can it also be a change of status?
I think probably the second one. There are definitely people who say it's got to be easier to get into the United States. Maybe the net effect has to be more immigrants, but I'm not sure that there's a really strong justification for that in terms of the words. So I would say probably more the second one. Yep.
Wait, why does it difference between immigrants and lawful permanent resident and lawful permanent status?
There's not. Immigrant means someone who has lawful permanent residence.
Oh,
Yep. And another word is green card. That's so like someone who has a green card. Yep. Please.
They're both classified as aliens, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
There was someone back here who I said was number 3. Yep.
What does it take to reverse a travel ban?
Yeah. Congress maybe, or a different executive. A different executive for sure. But Congress can probably do something in that regard. So far they have declined to do that. But they would have to sort of change the Immigration and Nationality Act. Okay. I'm gonna cut it off there, although I will be here for the time during the break. I'm gonna give you all a 5-minute break, and we will resume at 10:35.